The screaming had stopped an hour ago, but the silence was worse. Gideon Tull crouched in the pre-dawn darkness outside his chicken coop Winchester, trembling in hands that reeked of whiskey and regret. At 48, he'd grown intimate with death, had courted it nightly since the fever took Sarah and little Anna 3 winters past. But this wasn't the familiar embrace of his own destruction. This was something else entirely. The henhouse door hung twisted on its hinges, and his birds huddled in the far corner like congregants at a funeral. Their black eyes reflected a terror so pure it cut through his alcoholic haze like a blade. He'd seen that look before in Anna's eyes as the fever consumed her, in his own reflection every godforsaken morning since. A loose board beneath the roost had been pried up, revealing a hollow space that shouldn't exist. Something stirred in the shadows below, and Gideon's finger found the trigger just as a face emerged from the darkness. Chinese. A girl maybe 16, her delicate features marred by fresh bruises and rope burns. The railroad brand on her shoulder, Brandt's double B mark, was still weeping blood. When she looked up at him with eyes that held more suffering than any child should carry, her whispered words shattered what remained of his carefully constructed numbness. "Please, don't let them take me back to the dark place." For the first time in 3 years, Gideon Tull felt something stronger than grief. He felt rage. Iron Bluff existed in the shadow of men's ambitions, a festering wound on the high desert where silver and steel bred corruption like maggots in meat. The town served one master, Lucien Brandt, whose empire of mines, cattle, and railroad stretched across 3 territories like a spider's web. What he didn't own, he controlled. What he couldn't control, he destroyed. Gideon's farm squatted 2 miles from town, close enough to taste the smoke from Brandt's smelters, but far enough to nurture the illusion of independence. He'd bought the land 12 years ago, when Sarah carried their first child, dreaming of raising cattle and children under the endless sky. Now it was just him and the ghosts and the bottle that kept their whispers at bay. The girl, Lian Zhao, she'd told him between shuddering breaths, sat wrapped in Sarah's favorite quilt, clutching a tin cup of coffee with hands that shook like autumn leaves. Her English emerged in careful fragments, each word weighted with fear. "They bring many girls on train. Promise good work, new life in America." She touched the brand on her shoulder and winced. "But they take us underground, make us work in bad places, do bad things." Gideon had heard whispers, Chinese women vanishing from the railroad camps, stories of hidden chambers beneath the Silver Crown mine, where Brandt entertained certain visitors. He dismissed them as frontier gossip, the kind of tales that grew with each telling around saloon tables. Looking at Lian's haunted eyes, he knew every whisper was true. "I keep the books." She continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I read, write English and Chinese. They make me record everything, names, money, where girls go. They think because I am Chinese girl, I am nothing. Invisible." From her torn sleeve, she produced a small brass key wrapped in cloth. "I hide real ledger when they plan to sell me to bad man in Denver. Everything is there, names of buyers, amounts of money, where girls are taken. I bury it by old tree behind your barn, but they catch me trying to get it back." Through the kitchen window, Gideon could see the ancient birch she meant. Sarah used to read there on summer evenings, Anna curled in her lap like a sleepy cat. The tree had witnessed their happiness, their hopes, their dreams of a future that never came. Now it guarded secrets that could topple an empire. "Why didn't you just run?" Gideon asked, though he already suspected the answer. Lian's eyes hardened with a determination that made her look decades older. "Because if I run, they catch me, kill me, and nothing changes. But if I get that book..." She met his gaze steadily. "If I get that book, maybe I save the others." Outside, the wind rattled the windows with skeletal fingers. Gideon thought of Anna of the night. She'd begged him not to leave her alone with the fever. Of Sarah, who'd blamed him for chasing rustlers while their daughter died. Of all the times he'd chosen duty over family justice, over love. "You can't stay here," he said, though something in his chest, was already rebelling against the words. Brandt's men will come looking. I know. Lian pulled the quilt tighter. But I have nowhere else to go. And you? She studied his face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read men's souls for survival. You are broken like me, but not cruel, not owned. The observation cut deep because it was true. Gideon had built his isolation deliberately, brick by brick, bottle by bottle. He'd made himself irrelevant to Brandt's empire, too small to matter, too drunk to threaten. It had kept him alive, but it had also killed everything worth living for. There's a root cellar, he heard himself say. Hidden entrance separate from the house. You can hide there tonight. And tomorrow. Tomorrow we get that ledger. They came with the dying light, 8 riders silhouetted against the blood-red sky like harbingers of the apocalypse. Gideon had just finished disguising the cellar entrance when the thunder of hooves announced their arrival. Cole Hart led them, Brandt's personal enforcer, a man whose reputation for violence preceded him like the stench of death. Behind him rode Sheriff Dalton, his star catching the last rays of sunlight, his face carved with the resigned lines of a man who'd sold his soul and was still paying installments. Gideon met them on his porch, Winchester across his knees, trying to project the image of a man with nothing to hide. The need for whiskey clawed at his insides like a living thing, but he forced his hands to remain steady. Evening, gentlemen, he said, nodding to each in turn. Bit late for social calls. Hart spat tobacco juice into the dirt, his eyes never leaving Gideon's face. He was all sinew and scar tissue with the cold calculation of a predator who'd learned to enjoy the hunt. Cut the shit, Tull. We're tracking stolen property. Don't have much worth stealing, Gideon replied. Unless you count chickens that won't lay. Chinese girl. Hart continued dismounting with fluid grace. About 16, branded with a double B, ran from a transport yesterday. Trail leads here. Sheriff Dalton shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, his hand resting on his gun butt. Now, Cole, we can't be certain. I'm certain. Hart cut him off. Certain as death and taxes. Girl was seen near the old mining road. This is the closest spread. And Tull here? His smile was sharp as a blade. Well, let's just say he's got a history of sticking his nose where it don't belong. That was news to Gideon. He'd been careful to stay invisible to avoid any entanglements with Brandt's business. But Hart's words carried the weight of long-held suspicion. Feel free to look around, Gideon said. But you won't find any stolen property, Chinese or otherwise. Hart's men spread out with practiced efficiency, checking the barn, the chicken coop, the small shed where Gideon kept his tools. They were thorough, but not imaginative ranch hands playing at detective work. None thought to check the carefully concealed root cellar. House too, Hart said. You got paper for that? Hart's hand moved to his Colt. I got all the authority I need. Sheriff Dalton's face was a study in conflict. The law's still the law, Cole. Need proper cause for a house search. The law. Hart's voice dripped contempt. Is whatever Mr. Brandt says it is. And right now, he says we find that girl. The 3 men formed a triangle of tension hands, near weapons, the air thick with the promise of violence. Then Dalton spoke again, his voice carefully neutral. We'll take your word for it, Gideon. But if you're lying... He paused, choosing his words like a man walking through a minefield. Well, accidents happen. Especially to men who live alone. Men who drink too much. Men who might not be careful with their lanterns. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Gideon felt ice settle in his chest, not fear, but recognition. He'd been cataloged, filed away in Brandt's ledger of potential problems. His isolation, meant to protect him, had become a weapon aimed at his heart. I understand, he said quietly. Hart mounted his horse, but his gaze remained fixed on Gideon's face. You hide Brandt's merchandise, you burn with your house. That's not a threat, Tool. That's a promise. They rode away as the first stars appeared, hoofbeats fading into the vast silence of the high desert. Gideon waited until their dust had settled before opening the cellar. Lian crouched in the darkness, gripping a kitchen knife, her eyes wide with barely controlled terror. "They're gone," he said. "For now." She climbed out slowly, legs shaking. "They will come back. Probably. You should let me go. If they find me here, they won't." The words came out harder than he'd intended, surprising them both. "I won't let them." Lian stared at him. "Why, you don't know me. You owe me nothing." Gideon looked toward the birch tree where Sarah used to read fairy tales about heroes who saved the innocent and lived happily ever after. Children's stories, all of them. But maybe there was still time to write one true ending. Because, he said, a man's got to stand for something, even if it kills him. The night brought memories wrapped in barbed wire and soaked in whiskey. Gideon sat at his kitchen table cleaning his weapons while Lian tossed fitfully on the couch. The Winchester, his father's Navy Colt, the skinning knife that had belonged to his grandfather, tools of survival, in a land that killed the weak and unlucky with equal indifference. Lian cried out in her sleep words in rapid Mandarin that needed no translation. Her dreams were haunted landscapes of violence and degradation, populated by men who saw her as nothing more than property to be bought and sold. When she woke, tears traced silver paths down her cheeks. "Bad dreams?" Gideon asked unnecessarily. She nodded, pulling Sarah's quilt around her shoulders like armor. "Always bad dreams, since they take me from camp. Time moves different in dark places." "How long?" 9 months, maybe 10. She struggled with the English, her exhaustion making the words clumsy. "Hard to count days when you never see sun." Gideon poured coffee, his hands steady despite the craving that gnawed at his insides like acid. "Tell me about the ledger." Lian's expression grew distant. "Mr. Brandt, he thinks Chinese girls are invisible. We all look same to him. Yes, he puts me in his office, makes me keep books. I think he likes having someone who cannot betray him, someone who has no voice. But you could read everything. Everything. Names of men who buy girls. How much they pay. Where they take them: Denver, San Francisco, New York. Some go to rich men's houses as servants. Some go to..." She shuddered. "Places where girls never come back." She described the ledger in meticulous detail, leather-bound thick as a man's fist, filled with Brandt's careful handwriting and her own neat columns of figures. A catalogue of human misery, methodical and complete. "I make copy," she said. "Small copy with just names and numbers. Hide it in my clothes. But real book has everything: documents, letters, photographs, evidence that cannot be denied. And you buried it under the birch tree. In tin box, wrapped in oilcloth, safe from rain and..." She looked toward the window. But maybe not safe from men. Gideon stood, decision crystallizing in his mind like frost on glass. "We'll get it. Tonight." "No." Lian grabbed his arm. "Too dangerous. If they watching..." "They're not watching the tree. They're watching the roads, the house. They think you're hiding inside, not digging up evidence in the yard." It was a calculated risk, but everything was risk now. Gideon had chosen his side the moment he'd pulled her from that chicken coop. There was no neutral ground in this war. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, Lian leading despite her injuries. The birch tree stood sentinel against the star-drunk sky, its bare branches reaching toward heaven like prayers made manifest. At its base, nearly hidden by fallen leaves, lay a small patch of disturbed earth. "Here," Lian whispered, dropping to her knees. They dug with their hands, afraid to risk the sound of metal on stone. The earth was soft, recently turned, and soon Gideon's fingers found the tobacco tin wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, something that felt like salvation itself. "Got it," he breathed. A twig snapped in the darkness behind them. Gideon spun, drawing his Colt, but the shadows revealed only shifting pine boughs and starlight. The wind sighed through the branches, carrying scents of snow and something else, tobacco leather, the unmistakable musk of men who lived by violence. "Someone's out there," he whispered. They crept back to the house, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a harbinger of doom. Once inside, Gideon barricaded the door, while Lian unwrapped the tin with trembling fingers. The ledger was everything she'd promised, thick, leather-bound, filled with damning evidence. But it was more than records. Between the pages were photographs, documents, even what appeared to be a detailed map of underground tunnels. This wasn't just proof of Brandt's crimes. It was a blueprint of his entire operation. Jesus Christ! Gideon breathed, turning pages. This is enough to bring down half the territory. Lian nodded grimly. Now you understand why they want me dead, and why they will kill anyone who helps me. A sound from outside froze them both. Not hoofbeats this time, but something worse, the soft whisper of men, moving on foot, surrounding the house like wolves, circling wounded prey. Gideon blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, just as orange light bloomed outside the windows. His barn was burning. The flames painted the night in hellish hues, casting dancing shadows that made the surrounding darkness seem alive with malevolent spirits. Gideon watched his life's work burn from the kitchen window, and the ledger pressed against his chest like a shield. Hart's men had positioned themselves in a loose circle around the fire, and their faces demonic in the shifting light. They weren't trying to hide anymore. This was theater, a message written in smoke and flame. "They know," Lian whispered. "Someone told them." But who Gideon had shared his secret with no one, had done nothing to attract attention. Unless Martha Green, his nearest neighbor, a widow, struggling to keep her farm afloat after her husband's death in a mine accident. She'd visited yesterday, bringing soup and seemingly innocent gossip, asking casual questions about the strange sounds from his property. Martha, who was 3 months behind on her mortgage payments to Brandt's bank. Martha, who needed money desperately enough to sell her soul for it. "Mrs. Green," he said, the words bitter as alkali water. "She was here yesterday, asking questions." Lian's face hardened. "Brandt pays well for information, especially about his lost property." The fire spread from the barn to the surrounding brush, creeping toward the house like a living entity. Hart's men sat motionless on their horses, waiting. They weren't here to capture or arrest. They were here to watch him burn. "Well, we need to go," Gideon said. "Now. Where they have horses' guns. We have nothing. We have this." He held up the ledger. "And we have the mountain." The root cellar was their only hope. But more than that, it was their ace in the hole. Years ago, when the mine played out and the tunnels were abandoned, Gideon had connected his cellar to the old shaft system. It was meant to be a storm shelter, but now it was their lifeline to freedom. They slipped out the back door as flames reached the front porch. The tunnel entrance was hidden beneath a false floor in the cellar, narrow and black as the grave. They crawled on hands and knees, the ledger wrapped in oilcloth and tucked inside Gideon's coat. Behind them, shouts erupted as Hart's men discovered the burning house was empty. The tunnel opened into a labyrinth of abandoned mine shafts that honeycombed the mountain like a termite's nest. Gideon had explored parts of it as a boy, but much remained unmapped territory, where a man could easily lose himself forever. "This way," he whispered, leading Lian deeper into the mountain's bowels. They climbed for hours through passages that seemed to breathe with their own malevolent life. The air grew thin and bitter cold, their breath misting in the absolute darkness. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but never disappeared entirely. Dawn found them on a narrow ledge overlooking the valley. Iron Bluff spread below, like a child's toy town, smoke rising from chimneys and smelters. To the east, the railroad stretched toward the territorial capital, a thin line of steel connecting Brandt's empire to the outside world. "Federal marshals," Gideon said. "The ledger proves crimes across territorial lines. That makes it federal jurisdiction." "Marshals are 4 days away," Lian replied. "Brandt's men will find us before then." She was right. They had supplies for maybe 2 days, and Hart knew these mountains better than anyone. Discovery was inevitable. Then we make our stand in town, Gideon decided. Find someone we can trust. Who Brandt owns everyone. Not everyone. Judge Morrison is due tomorrow for the circuit court. He's federal answers to Washington, not local interests. Lian shook her head. You think Judge cannot be bought. You think money has no power over federal men. Her cynicism was born of experience. But Gideon clung to hope like a drowning man, clutching driftwood. It's our only chance. That night, they began their descent back toward civilization, moving through pine forests that whispered secrets in the wind. The town lay sleeping below them, unaware that its fate hung in the balance. As they crept through Iron Bluff's back alleys, Gideon felt the weight of the ledger against his chest like a second heart. Everything depended on finding one honest man in a corrupt world, one person who couldn't be bought, threatened, or destroyed. The church bell tolled midnight as they reached the Frontier Hotel. Through the windows, Gideon could see lights in the upper floors where Judge Morrison would be staying. Their salvation lay 3 stories above, behind a door they had to pray would open to justice rather than betrayal. But as they approached the hotel's rear entrance, Gideon caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows across the street. Watchers. Brandt's men waiting for exactly this moment. They were walking into a trap, but it was the only trap they had. The hotel's back stairs creaked like old bones as they climbed toward the 3rd floor. Gideon's heart hammered against his ribs, each step bringing them closer to salvation or damnation. The ledger pressed against his chest, felt heavier with each passing moment, weighted with the lives it represented and the justice it promised. Room 312. Judge Morrison's room, according to the hotel registry they'd glimpsed at the front desk. Gideon raised his hand to knock, then froze. Voices leaked through the door, low, urgent, unmistakably conspiratorial. Understand your position, Your Honor, but the situation has evolved beyond our original arrangement. Ice water flooded Gideon's veins. That smooth, cultured voice, with its faint southern drawl, could only belong to one man, Lucien Brandt himself. I won't be party to wholesale murder, came another voice. Judge Morrison, but weak defeated. I've overlooked your business ventures, but this crosses every line. You'll cross whatever lines I tell you to cross. Brandt replied with casual menace. Or perhaps you'd prefer I send certain photographs to your wife in Denver. I'm sure she'd find them fascinating reading. Silence stretched like a taut wire. Then Morrison's voice, broken and hollow. What do you want? Simple. When Hart brings the girl in tomorrow, you sentence her to hang. Quick trial, quicker execution. Problem solved. On what charges? Theft of property valued at over $50. That's a capital offense in this territory. Gideon closed his eyes, feeling the last pillars of his hope crumble to dust. The federal judge was compromised, owned as completely as every other man in Brandt's web. There was no law here, no justice, only the will of whoever held the most power. Beside him, Lian had gone deathly pale. She understood every word, grasped the implications with the clarity of someone who'd spent months documenting Brandt's crimes. They were truly alone. But first, Brandt continued, we need to find that ledger. The girl didn't bury it randomly. She chose a location she could remember, somewhere significant. My men are checking every tree, every landmark within a mile of Tull's farm. And if they don't find it, oh, they'll find it, along with Tull and the girl. Dead, of course. Tragic accident cave-in in the old mine shafts. These things happen when desperate criminals try to hide in dangerous places. A floorboard creaked behind them. Well. Cole Hart's voice was soft as silk and twice as deadly. Look what crawled out of the rat hole. Gideon spun to find Hart and 3 of his men blocking the hallway, guns already drawn. The enforcer's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. You boys really thought you could waltz into town and play hero? Did you honestly believe we were that stupid? How did you know? Gideon asked, though his heart was already sinking with the knowledge. Mrs. Green's got sharp eyes and a desperate need for money. She's been watching your place for 2 days, waiting for you to make your move. Saw you digging by that old tree, saw you heading up the mountain. Even followed you part of the way down. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade. Martha, who'd shared meals at his table and mourned with him when Sarah died. Martha, who'd sold him for 30 pieces of silver and a promise of debt forgiveness. The ledger. Hart continued, eyes glittering with avarice. Hand it over and maybe we'll make it quick. Gideon's hand moved slowly toward his coat, but not in surrender. The Navy Colt was there loaded and ready. If he was going to die, he'd take some of these bastards with him. Easy now, Hart warned. Remember, we need the girl breathing long enough to tell us where she hid the real evidence. What are you talking about? Lian's voice was barely a whisper. The door to room 312 opened, and Brandt stepped out immaculate in his expensive suit, looking more like a successful businessman than a monster. Judge Morrison followed, his face gray with shame and fear. Ah, Brandt said, his smile cold as winter moonlight. Our missing property, and Mr. Tull, the would-be knight-errant. How disappointingly predictable. You bastard, Gideon snarled. You're destroying innocent lives. I'm building an empire, Brandt replied calmly. Empires require sacrifice, usually from people too weak to prevent it. He turned to Lian, who stood pressed against the wall like a cornered animal. You've caused me considerable trouble, my dear. But that ends now. The ledger has everything, she whispered. All your crimes, all your secrets. Brandt's laugh was genuinely amused. Oh, my dear child. You still don't understand, do you, that ledger you stole? It's incomplete. A test designed to flush out exactly this kind of treachery. The words hit like physical blows. Lian staggered, her face crumpling with despair. No, she breathed. I saw everything. I wrote everything. You wrote what I wanted you to write. Oh, there's enough truth there to be mildly embarrassing, but nothing that would hold up in any court. The real records, the truly damaging evidence, that's elsewhere beyond your reach. But even as he spoke, Brandt's eyes remained fixed on the ledger pressed against Gideon's chest. There was hunger there, and something else, fear. Whatever he claimed this book contained, secrets he desperately wanted to keep buried. However, Brandt continued, there is the matter of loose ends. The girl will hang, of course. But you, Mr. Tull, present a different problem. A war veteran, a respected member of the community. Your death needs to look natural. So you'll murder me in cold blood. Nothing so crude. You're a drunk, a broken man consumed by grief. It's tragic how you finally decided to join your wife and daughter. A bottle of laudanum, a note expressing your final remorse. These tragedies happen all too often on the frontier. Hart raised his gun, but before he could fire, the hotel shook with a tremendous explosion that rattled every window in the building. Screams echoed through the night, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began tolling in alarm. What the hell? Hart spun toward the nearest window. In that moment of confusion, Gideon struck. He grabbed Lian, pulling her toward the stairwell as his Colt cleared leather. The narrow hallway erupted in gunfire bullets, splintering wood and shattering glass. They ran, taking the stairs 3 at a time, while Hart's curses echoed behind them. The explosion had given them a chance, but Gideon had no illusions about their prospects. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a hostile town where every hand was turned against them. The hotel lobby was chaos. Guests milled about in nightclothes, demanding answers about the explosion. Through the front windows, Gideon could see an orange glow on the horizon. Something big was burning. "At the mine," someone shouted. The Silver Crown mine collapsed. Explosion took out half the mountain. Another voice added, "Must be 30 men trapped inside." Gideon felt the blood drain from his face. The Silver Crown mine, where Brandt kept his human cargo, where dozens of Chinese girls lived in conditions worse than any prison. If the mine had collapsed, they're all dead. Lian whispered, reading his expression. All the girls. He killed them all to hide his crimes. The front doors burst open, and Martha Green stumbled in, her face streaked with soot and tears, her dress torn and singed. When she saw Gideon, her eyes filled with shame and desperate hope. "Thank God you're alive," she sobbed. "I thought, when I heard the explosion, I thought you were in the mine." "What happened, Martha?" Gideon asked, though he already suspected he knew. "I was watching the mine like they paid me to do. But when I saw all those men going in with dynamite, when I realized what they were planning..." She broke down completely. "I tried to warn them. I tried to stop it. But there were so many girls down there and they wouldn't listen, and then it was too late. You tried to stop it. I knew what I'd done was wrong, but I never imagined they'd commit mass murder. So I ran to the mine, tried to warn the girls to get out. But the tunnels were too deep, too many guards, and then..." She gestured helplessly at the orange glow outside. Behind them, boots pounded on the hotel stairs. Hart and his men were coming, and there was nowhere left to run. But as Gideon looked at Martha's tear-streaked face, at the genuine horror and remorse in her eyes, he realized something crucial. She hadn't just tried to stop the mine explosion, she'd witnessed it. She'd seen Brandt's men plant the dynamite, heard their orders, watched them commit murder on a massive scale. "Martha," he said urgently, "you saw them do it. You can testify." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I saw everything, every detail. And I know where they went afterward. There's a train leaving at dawn, heading for the territorial capital. Brandt's already on it." Hart's voice echoed from the stairwell. "Find them. They can't have gotten far." But Gideon was already moving, leading Lian and Martha toward the hotel's rear exit. They had a witness now, someone who'd seen Brandt's men commit mass murder. It wasn't much, but it was something. As they slipped into the alley behind the hotel, Gideon clutched the ledger tighter against his chest. Incomplete or not, it was still evidence. Combined with Martha's testimony about the mine explosion, it might be enough to bring down Brandt's empire. If they could survive long enough to tell their story. The abandoned silver mine, 3 miles north of Iron Bluff, had been worked out 5 years ago, but its tunnels still threaded through the mountain like arteries in a corpse. Martha led them through passages that existed in perpetual midnight, their footsteps echoing off wet stone walls that seemed to weep with the mountain's pain. "My husband died in these tunnels," she explained as they walked, her voice hollow with grief and guilt. Cave-in took him and 6 other men. Brandt paid the widows $50 each and called it generous compensation. The shame in her voice was palpable. She'd betrayed them for money, sold them to a monster. But the mine explosion had shown her the true cost of her collaboration. Now she was trying to make amends. Though forgiveness seemed as distant as the stars. "I've been thinking about what Brandt said," she continued. "About the ledger being incomplete. But what if he was lying? What if he was trying to make you despair, make you give up?" "He wasn't lying," Lian said quietly. "I can feel it. There were things I never saw, places I was not allowed to go. The ledger I stole has truth, but not all truth." They emerged into a natural cavern lit by oil lamps Martha had placed earlier. Supplies lined the walls, food, water, blankets, ammunition. She'd been planning this refuge for hours, ever since she'd witnessed the mine explosion and understood what Brandt was capable of. But it's not the only evidence. she said, pulling a canvas sack from behind some supplies. "I've been keeping my own records. Notes, observations, even some photographs I took with my husband's old camera." Lian grabbed the sack, examining its contents with growing excitement. "These are the missing pieces. The connections between Brandt's local operation and the buyers in other territories. Names, dates, money transfers." "Is it enough?" Gideon asked. "With what's in the ledger, yes. More than enough to hang him and everyone who worked with him." Outside, the sound of horses and shouting voices echoed through the canyon. Hart's men were closing in, following their trail through the snow like bloodhounds scenting prey. "How long before they find us?" Gideon asked. "Not long," Martha admitted. "I tried to cover our tracks, but there are too many of them, and they know these mountains." The voices were getting closer, more urgent. Hart was coordinating a systematic search, checking every cave, every hiding place. They had maybe an hour before discovery became inevitable. "There's another way out," Martha said. "A passage that leads to the old railroad cut. But its dangerous part of the tunnel system is unstable, and the route is narrow." "How dangerous?" "The ceiling could collapse at any moment. One wrong step, one loud noise, and tons of rock come down. My husband always said those tunnels were death traps waiting to spring. They had no choice." The sounds of pursuit were growing louder, and Hart's men had spread out to cover all the obvious exits. The dangerous passage was their only hope. Martha led them deeper into the mine, through corridors that grew progressively narrower and more treacherous. The air became thick and hard to breathe, and the walls seemed to press inward from all sides. "Here," she whispered, pointing to a gap in the rock, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "This leads to the railroad cut. Maybe 200 yards, but you have to move slowly, carefully, and quietly." "What about you?" Lian asked. "I'll stay. Try to misdirect them when they get here, buy you some time." "They'll kill you," Gideon said bluntly. "Probably. But I've got blood on my hands now, the blood of those girls in the mine. I can't live with that. Won't live with it." She pressed her husband's rifle into Gideon's hands, along with 2 boxes of ammunition. "There's a freight train that stops at the cut every morning for water. Flag it down, get to the territorial capital. Find someone who can't be bought or threatened." The sound of boots on stone echoed through the tunnels. Hart's men had found the entrance to their refuge. "Go," Martha whispered. "Go now before it's too late." Gideon wanted to argue to find another way that didn't require her sacrifice. But there was no time for debate. He squeezed through the gap, helping Lian after him. The passage beyond was barely wide enough for their shoulders, with a ceiling so low they had to crawl on hands and knees. Behind them, gunshots erupted. Martha's voice rose in defiance, shouting lies about their escape route to throw Hart's men off the scent. She was buying them time with her life, trying to atone for her betrayal in the only way she knew how. The passage seemed endless. Every movement brought a shower of loose rock from above, and the air grew thinner with each labored breath. Gideon's lungs burned, his heart hammered against his ribs, and the weight of the ledger pressed against his chest like a stone. Then suddenly, they were through. The passage opened onto a narrow ledge overlooking the railroad, cut where the tracks curved around the mountain on their way to the territorial capital. Dawn was breaking over the peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and crimson. "We made it." Lian gasped, but her relief was short-lived. The sound of horses coming fast along the railroad right-of-way echoed up from below. Hart and his surviving men had found another route to the cut, and they were riding hard to intercept any escape attempt. Gideon pulled out his father's pocket watch. 6:30 in the morning. The freight train wasn't due for another hour, time they didn't have. "There." Lian pointed to a rocky outcrop 50 yards down the track. "We can take cover, wait for the train." They scrambled down the steep slope, rocks sliding beneath their feet. The outcrop provided decent cover, but it also trapped them in a killing field. If the train didn't come soon, they'd be target practice for Hart's rifles. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by Hart's voice. "Tull, I know you're up there. Come down peaceful and we'll make it quick." Gideon checked his ammunition, 10 rounds in the rifle, 6 in his Colt. Not enough to fight off Hart's entire crew, but maybe enough to buy precious time. "Give up the girl, Tull." Hart's voice carried clearly across the canyon. This doesn't have to be your fight. But it was his fight. Had been from the moment he'd pulled Lian from that chicken coop and seen the terror in her eyes. Some fights chose you whether you wanted them or not. The morning erupted in violence. Gideon's first shot took Hart's lead rider from his saddle, the man tumbling into the rocky streambed with a scream that echoed off the canyon walls. The others scattered, taking cover behind boulders and scraggly pines, their return fire immediate and methodical. "Stay down!" Gideon shouted to Lian as bullets whined off the rocks around them. She pressed herself against the stone, clutching the ledger and Martha's evidence to her chest. Her face was pale, but determined, the look of someone who'd seen too much death to be paralyzed by fear. "How many bullets?" she asked. "Not enough." The battle settled into a deadly rhythm. Hart's men had superior numbers and position, but the rocky outcrop provided good cover. Gideon made every shot count, forcing them to keep their heads down, preventing any coordinated advance. But ammunition was finite, and Hart had all the time in the world. "You're just making this harder on yourself." Hart called out. "Brandt's got judges, marshals, even some territorial officials in his pocket. You think that little book is going to change anything?" "It's not about the book anymore," Gideon replied, squeezing off another round. "It's about those girls, about what's right." "Right." Hart's laughter was bitter and ugly. "This is the frontier, Tull. There is no right, only strong and weak, and you picked the losing side." A distant whistle echoed through the canyon. The freight train still miles away, but approaching fast. If they could hold out just a little longer. Hart heard it too. "Time's up, boys. Take them now." The final assault came from 3 directions simultaneously. Hart's men moved with the coordination of a wolf pack, using covering fire to advance from boulder to boulder. Gideon's rifle cracked repeatedly, but for every man he drove back, 2 more pressed forward. His ammunition ran out just as they reached the outcrop. "Shit," he breathed, drawing his Colt with hands that shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. The first man over the rocks was young, maybe 20, with a desperate look of someone who joined Hart's crew because he had nowhere else to go. Gideon's bullet took him center mass, spinning him around and sending him tumbling back down the slope. The second attacker was older, craftier, more experienced. He came from the side, using the dead boy's body as cover. Gideon's shot went wide, and the man's return fire shattered rock inches from his head. Then Lian was there, Martha's rifle in her hands, firing with the grim determination of someone who'd witnessed too much evil to remain passive. Her bullet caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around long enough for Gideon to finish him. "Behind you," Lian screamed. Gideon spun to see Cole Hart himself climbing over the rocks, his gun already trained on Lian's head. The enforcer's face was twisted with rage and bloodlust, his eyes burning with the light of a man who'd killed so many times that murder had become second nature. "Drop it," Hart snarled. "Both of you, now." Gideon's Colt was empty, but he kept it trained on Hart anyway. "Let her go. This is between you and me. This is between me and Brandt's property. You're just an obstacle." The train whistle sounded again, much closer now. Hart's eyes flicked toward the sound, and in that moment of distraction, Gideon lunged. They went down in a tangle of limbs and violence, fighting for control of Hart's weapon. The enforcer was younger and stronger, but Gideon had the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. They rolled across the rocky ground, each trying to gain the upper hand. Hart's gun discharged the bullet, screaming harmlessly into the sky. Gideon drove his elbow into the younger man's ribs, feeling bone crack. Hart responded with a vicious headbutt that sent stars exploding across Gideon's vision. "You should have stayed drunk and out of my way," Hart gasped, his hands closing around Gideon's throat. The world began to gray around the edges. Gideon's vision tunneled, his strength fading as oxygen became a precious commodity. But as consciousness slipped away, he heard something that made his heart leap with desperate hope. More horses coming fast from the north. Hart heard them too. His grip loosened slightly as he turned to identify the new arrivals. That moment of distraction was all Gideon needed. He broke free, rolling away, just as the first of the newcomers crested the ridge. Federal marshals. A half-dozen of them, led by a man with steel-gray hair and a badge that caught the morning sunlight. They spread out along the ridge, rifles trained on Hart's surviving men. "Federal marshals," the lead rider commanded. "Drop your weapons, you're surrounded." But this wasn't the convenient rescue Gideon had expected. These men looked grim, professional, and oddly familiar. Something about their leader's face nagged at his memory. Hart's remaining men looked at each other, calculating odds. They were outnumbered, caught in the open with no cover. One by one they threw down their guns, but Hart himself wasn't finished. Even as his men surrendered, he rolled toward where Lian crouched behind a boulder, his backup pistol appearing in his hand like a magician's trick. "You want the girl?" he snarled. "Come and take her." The shot that ended Cole Hart's life came from an unexpected direction. Not from the marshals, not from Gideon, but from the slope above. Sheriff Dalton stood there, smoking rifle in his hands, his face carved with lines of profound regret. "I'm sorry," he said, though whether to Hart or to himself was unclear. "I'm sorry it came to this." Hart pitched forward, his pistol clattering harmlessly across the rocks. He was dead before he hit the ground. The lead marshal dismounted, his movements careful and deliberate. As he approached, Gideon finally recognized him. Marshal William Thorne, a man whose reputation for incorruptibility was legendary across 3 territories. "You're lucky we got here when we did," Thorne said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and experience. "We've been tracking Brandt's operation for months." "Someone sent word?" Gideon asked. "Anonymous telegram yesterday. Just said to come fast, that people were dying and evidence was about to be destroyed." Gideon looked up at Sheriff Dalton, who was slowly descending the slope. The man's face was etched with shame and something else, relief perhaps, at finally being able to do the right thing. "You sent the telegram," Gideon said. It wasn't a question. Dalton nodded. "I've been Brandt's man for 5 years. Did things, terrible things. But when I heard about the mine explosion, when I realized he'd murdered all those girls just to cover his tracks..." He shook his head. "A man's got to draw the line somewhere." "What about Brandt?" Lian asked. "In custody as of an hour ago," Thorne replied. "Along with Judge Morrison and half the territorial administration. Your ledger, combined with the witness testimony about the mine explosion, gave us everything we needed. The girls in the mine, 23 dead. But we found survivors at other locations, girls who were being held at the ranch in town, at way stations along the railroad. Your evidence helped us find them all. 23 dead. The number hit Gideon like a physical blow. 23 young women who dreamed of new lives in America, who'd instead found only darkness and death. Their blood was on his hands too, because he'd been too drunk, too selfish, too wrapped up in his own grief to act sooner. But there were survivors. Lives saved because he'd found the courage to pull one terrified girl from a chicken coop and refused to let her go. The freight train wheezed to a stop at the water tower, its engineer curious about the commotion, but wise enough to stay in his cab. Marshal Thorne's men had secured the scene, rounding up Hart's surviving crew and taking detailed statements from everyone involved. "Martha Green?" Gideon asked. "Alive," Dalton replied. "Hart's men roughed her up some, but she'll recover. She's going to face charges for her part in the conspiracy, but given what she did at the end..." He shrugged. "A good lawyer could make a case for clemency." "And the corruption, how deep did it go?" "Deep enough," Thorne said grimly. Brandt's operation reached into 3 territories, involved federal judges, territorial officials, even some congressmen. It's going to take months to sort through all the connections. Lian sat apart from the others, staring at the ledger in her hands. She looked older than her years, aged by everything she'd seen and endured. But there was something else in her expression now, not just pain, but purpose. "What happens to the survivors?" she asked. "The girls we saved?" "That's up to them," Thorne replied. "Some will want to return to China. Others will stay, try to build new lives here. There's a Chinese benevolent society in San Francisco that's offered to help." "And what about justice for the girls who died?" "Brandt and his associates will hang," Thorne said simply. "Every one of them. The territorial governor has already signed the execution orders. It wasn't perfect justice. The dead couldn't be brought back. Their suffering couldn't be undone. But it was something. In a world where the powerful preyed on the powerless with impunity, it was something." "What about us?" Gideon asked. "What happens now?" "You're heroes," Thorne said. "Both of you. The territorial governor wants to meet you, probably give you medals. The newspapers are already calling you the saviors of Iron Bluff." But Gideon wasn't thinking about medals or newspaper headlines. He was thinking about the long road ahead, about the corruption that had been exposed and the work that remained to be done. "There's something else," Lian said quietly. She pulled a folded paper from inside her sleeve, a page she'd torn from the ledger before showing it to anyone else. "Names. Important names. People who weren't caught, who escaped when Brandt's empire fell." Gideon looked at the list, his blood running cold. Senators, judges, businessmen, men whose power reached all the way to Washington. The trials they'd just witnessed were only the beginning. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Lian agreed. "It's just beginning. Resolution and final surprise." 6 months later, Gideon stood on the platform of the Denver train station watching Lian board the westbound express. The territorial trials had concluded with Brandt and his associates receiving the ultimate penalty. The mine explosion had been exposed as mass murder. The trafficking ring dismantled the corruption, rooted out at least the visible parts of it. Lian no longer looked like the terrified girl he'd found in his chicken coop. She'd testified at every trial, her courage helping to convict men who'd thought themselves untouchable. Now she was traveling to San Francisco, where the Chinese Benevolent Society had offered her a position helping other immigrants navigate the complexities of American life. "You could stay," Gideon offered. "There's good work here, people who need help." "My work is with people like me," she replied. "People who need someone to speak for them, to fight for them when no one else will. You taught me that." She was right, of course. In saving her, he'd learned something about himself, that grief and guilt didn't have to be the end of the story. That broken people could still choose to stand for something larger than their own pain. "What about you?" she asked. "Will you rebuild the farm?" Gideon shook his head. "Too many ghosts there. I'm thinking about moving on, maybe heading west. Marshal Thorne offered me a position with the Territorial Rangers. A lawman, a peacekeeper, someone who stands between the wolves and the sheep." The train whistle blew its mournful note, echoing across the mountains. Passengers began boarding, their voices a mixture of excitement and melancholy as they prepared for new journeys. They embraced this unlikely pair who'd found each other in darkness and fought their way out into the light. She pressed something into his hand, a small leather journal bound with string. "What's this?" "Insurance," she said quietly. "A complete record of everything we discovered, everyone we exposed, every connection we made. Keep it safe." "Why?" "Because the men on that list you saw, they're still out there. Still powerful, still dangerous. And someday, they're going to come for us." She boarded the train, settling into a window seat. As the locomotive pulled away from the station, Gideon noticed something that made his blood run cold. Three men in expensive suits stood at the far end of the platform, their attention focused on the departing train. One was taking notes in a small book, while another spoke quietly into a telegraph key at the station office. They'd been watching. They knew. As the train disappeared around a bend, one of the men looked directly at Gideon. The recognition was mutual. This was Senator Morrison's chief of staff, a man whose name had appeared in the hidden pages of Brandt's ledger. A man who'd escaped justice when the corruption trials focused on local officials. The man smiled, tipped his hat, and walked away. Gideon understood the message. The war was far from over. New enemies had emerged from the shadows, more powerful and dangerous than Brandt had ever been. But he also understood something else. He was no longer the broken, drunken man who'd hidden from the world in a bottle of whiskey. He was someone who fought for justice, who stood up for the powerless, who refused to let evil triumph through good men's inaction. Martha Green would serve 18 months in territorial prison before being released to a new life teaching school in a small farming community. She'd carry the weight of her choices forever, but she'd also carry the knowledge that her final act of courage had helped save lives. Sheriff Dalton would resign his position and become a deputy marshal, spending his remaining years hunting down the corrupt officials who'd escaped the initial trials. He'd never fully forgive himself for the things he'd done, but he'd dedicate his life to making amends. The rescued girls would scatter to the four winds, some returning to China, others building new lives in America. But they'd all carry with them the memory of two people who'd risked everything to give them a chance at freedom. And in the mountains above Iron Bluff, a new cemetery would be established, a place where 23 marble headstones bore the names of the girls who died in the mine. Their deaths had not been in vain. Their sacrifice had exposed a web of corruption that reached to the highest levels of government. As Gideon walked away from the train station, the leather journal tucked securely inside his coat, he felt a familiar presence at his shoulder. Not the ghosts of Sarah and Anna this time, but something else, the spirits of all the innocent people who died, because good men had done nothing. They whispered to him of work still to be done, of justice still to be served, of battles yet to be fought. And for the first time in years, Gideon smiled. He'd found his purpose again. He'd found his reason for living. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounded, carrying new passengers toward new destinies. And in the gathering dusk, a man walked toward an uncertain but purposeful future, armed with nothing but justice and the unshakable belief that sometimes, if you fought hard enough and sacrificed enough, right could triumph over might. The story of Iron Bluff was over. The legend of Gideon Tull was just beginning. 3 days later, the headlines would read, "Territorial Ranger found dead in hotel room, apparent suicide." But in a hidden safe deposit box in Denver, a leather journal would wait for the right person to find it, along with a note in Gideon's careful handwriting. For whoever finds this, the fight continues. Don't let them win through our silence. Don't let the innocent die because good people did nothing. The list is real. The corruption runs deeper than we imagined. Finish what we started. GT. The journal would remain hidden for 20 years until a young newspaper reporter named Sarah Tull, Gideon's daughter, who'd survived the fever that was supposed to have killed her, would discover it while researching a story about political corruption in the territorial government. She'd read her father's words, understand his sacrifice, and pick up the fight where he'd left off. But that's another story for another day. For now, it was enough that one man had found the courage to stand against the darkness, to pull one terrified girl from a chicken coop and refuse to let her go. It was enough that in a world where justice was bought and sold like cattle, two broken people had found a way to save each other. It was enough that the light had won, even if the victory came at the ultimate price.